One of the more controversial changes in the DSM-5 and in the ICD-11 is that they eliminated Asperger's disorder. This concerned a lot of people who worried that those previously diagnosed with Asperger's would no longer qualify for an autism-related diagnosis, and as a result, might lose access to much-needed services. Why did DSM-5 combine autistic disorder and Asperger's disorder into a single autism spectrum disorder diagnosis? In part, it was to address the problem of inflated diagnostic rates. A lot of people believed that Asperger's disorder was too inclusive of a diagnosis, and that diagnostic rates for it were grossly overinflated. In other words, critics, including Alan Francis, the psychiatrist who oversaw the DSM-4 when Asperger's was added to it, felt that the diagnosis led to too many false positives. The hope had been that by combining autistic disorder and Asperger's into a single autism spectrum diagnosis, we would get lower and ideally more accurate prevalence rates. However, people diagnosed with Asperger's were understandably alarmed at losing their diagnoses. The psychiatrists behind the DSM-5 assured them that anyone with an existing diagnosis could keep it. That is, these diagnoses were grandfathered in. But going forward, no new Asperger's diagnoses would be made, and this was expected to yield overall lower prevalence rates going forward. There is evidence that this has been the case, with some research suggesting that autism diagnoses are down markedly since the DSM-5 was implemented. However, the DSM-5 takes issue with claims that combining Asperger's and autistic disorder into a single autism spectrum diagnosis has sharply decreased the prevalence of autism diagnoses. Which is a little odd, because it seemed to many people that part of their intent originally in revamping these diagnoses was to decrease prevalence by eliminating false positive diagnoses. That's what all the concern about there being too many people receiving Asperger's diagnoses was all about to begin with. Nonetheless, to support their case that people didn't need to worry about prevalence rates going down too much, the DSM-5's authors pointed to research that 91% of children with DSM-4 pervasive developmental disorder diagnoses still qualified for the DSM-5's new autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. Despite the DSM-5's claims, though, other studies don't all support the idea that prevalence for autism hasn't decreased very much. Some studies suggest more substantial decreases in autism diagnoses under DSM-5 criteria, with anywhere from 50 to 75% of people with a DSM-4 autism diagnosis not qualifying for a DSM-5 autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. All of this is made much more uncertain because there isn't that much prevalence data yet for the new social pragmatic communication disorder. This is important because social pragmatic communication disorder was meant as a new diagnosis for some people who previously might have been diagnosed with autism or Asperger's, but who don't meet DSM-5's autism spectrum criteria. So, can people still be diagnosed with Asperger's? If you go by the DSM-5 and the ICD-11, then the answer is no, because someone who used to get an Asperger's diagnosis would now receive a diagnosis of mild autism spectrum disorder, right? Asperger's just isn't in DSM-5 and ICD-11 anymore. However, the answer isn't definitively no, because the ICD-10 remains the official diagnostic manual in most countries, right? And the ICD-10 predates both DSM-5 and obviously ICD-11. And ICD-10 has a code for Asperger's. Therefore, doctors can technically still use the Asperger's diagnostic code to make a diagnosis. However, most clinicians probably defer to the DSM-5, and many of them have therefore stopped using the Asperger's diagnosis. But just because Asperger's is on its way out as an official diagnosis doesn't mean that people who identify with the diagnosis have stopped using it. There are many self-identified Aspies out there who continue to use and identify with the Asperger's diagnosis. So just because the DSM and ICD have moved beyond the term, doesn't mean the public has.